Hi, I'm Dr. Owen Anderson. I'm the research director at Clarity Fund, and I'm back out here in the Arizona springtime doing some hiking. It's actually becoming late spring, so we won't see a lot of this green for much longer. So I thought this was a nice location. And today I was thinking especially about what is rational presuppositionalism. This is a method that we use at Clarity Fund. And someone might wonder, what is that? And it doesn't really roll off the tongue. It's kind of bulky term, rational presuppositionalism. Or someone who is theologically astute might say, yeah, isn't that what Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen do? So what I want to talk about here was, what is rational presuppositionalism? Maybe begin with what isn't rational presuppositionalism, and then what it is, and then look at maybe some common questions. So what's called presuppositionalism in apologetics is a view that starts by saying something like, we must begin with God to make sense of anything else. Now I call this fideistic presuppositionalism to distinguish it from rational presuppositionalism. And it's fideistic, meaning it relies on blind faith in that it makes an assertion, start with God, it's a metaphysical claim about what is real, and then argues to the rest of what we think from that. Now, someone could object to that, and they rightly should, and say, wait, but we'll give arguments to show you have to begin with God, or else you end up in a contradiction. And that's right. And really, that's classical apologetics then. You're no longer doing presuppositionalism, but you're saying, if we don't believe in God, if we don't begin with God, then we can't make sense of other things like the world or order or design or morality. So those are classical arguments, and they especially look at contradiction. So the presuppositionalist is telling us, if we don't begin with God in metaphysics, we end up with contradictions. So rational presuppositionalism is emphasizing that point, that we're really going to use reason, for example, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and we're going to use it to test our presuppositions for meaning. And that's what that phrase means, rational presuppositionalism. So we have beliefs, suppositions, and our beliefs have presuppositions. They have assumptions. And here's how you identify those. You know a presupposition because it's a belief that must be true for this supposition, for your other belief to be true. Your belief depends on that prior belief being true. So for example, if someone says, I think it's true that God is good. Well, this presupposes God is real. So first we have to look at God as real before we know if God can be good or not. And saying I know God is real presupposes we can know God. So we have to look at, is knowledge possible? So we go from a claim about the goodness of God, we see that, well, this presupposes a belief about if God is real, and that presupposes a belief about how we know anything. So we're looking at that order, going step and step back, and that's what rational presuppositionalism identifies, is those steps needed. So it isn't fideistic presuppositionalism. It isn't exactly classical apologetics in this sense, that we're especially recognizing that thought is ordered. Thought is systematic. Thought is not just a random set of beliefs and you kind of accumulate them and put them together in a mess. But there's an order. There are basic beliefs and not so basic beliefs. Beliefs that assume those basic things. So rational presuppositionalism is looking at, for example, proving God exists by going through steps. From the most basic thing we can say about God, which is that God is eternal, to God is a creator of the material world. The material world is not eternal, to the reality of the soul, and the soul is not eternal. God created, God is a designer, and then looking at the problem of evil. So going through steps like that, building up to the existence and reality of God, and really prior to those is, how do we know anything at all? So that's what it means, rational presuppositionalism, identifying our beliefs, identifying the assumptions that must be true for our beliefs to be true, and then using reason to test them for meaning. That's especially what reason does, as the law of non-contradiction. And we saw really other kinds of apologetics like presuppositionalism or classical apologetics are also relying on that law of non-contradiction. But rational presuppositionalism isn't really an apologetic method. It's an epistemological method, a philosophical tool. And that's one question someone might ask, is to say, well, isn't that really a theology? And I have been using examples about God's existence, and what we do at the Clarity Fund is we're especially interested in knowing God. And a lot of the persons who might object to us are persons who want to show we can't know God. So someone might say, yeah, isn't that theological? Well, no, it really isn't theological in a narrow sense. It may end up getting us into theological commitments as we start to explore presuppositional ideas. We may end up coming to believe things about God, but it really is a claim about the order of thought and beginning with what is self-evident. that it's self-evident that we think, that we are thinkers, and it's self-evident there are laws of thought, and then applying those to our beliefs in a presuppositional or systematic manner. And someone might say, but why should we start with your definition of reason? There's lots of definitions of reason. Well, here what we are using to mean reason is simply the laws of thought. And these aren't ours. These are the classical laws of thought that have been identified and used. And really they're inescapable. They're self-evident. A is A. Anyone who objects to them would be using them to object to them. So that's why we begin with them, not because they're ours or we particularly like them as opposed to others. It's not a claim about what we do or don't like, but about what is unavoidable, what is self-evident. And beginning with those, someone could ask, yeah, but how do you prove the laws of thought? How do you prove we should start with them? And really that's a category mistake. You don't prove the source of proof. We might ask, how do you prove we know God is real? How do we prove our beliefs about God's existence? But how do we prove A is A? Well, we use A is A to do proof. We don't really prove it. So that's a category mistake to say, how do we prove the laws of thought? Those are the things we use to prove things. So this is what we mean by rational presuppositionalism, using reason to test our beliefs, that our beliefs come in orders from basic to not basic, and then we can identify that order. It's not random, it's systematic. And it isn't the same as fideistic presuppositionalism. We don't want to begin with mere metaphysical assertions. And that is another one someone could ask. They could say, look, aren't you just doing what Cornelius Van Til did, for example? He might say you have to start with the God of the Bible. You say you have to start with reason. You both just start somewhere. Well, yeah, those aren't quite the same, right? One is a metaphysical claim about what is real. The other is a claim about where we have to start with thought. We have to begin with thinking. And then we move on from thinking to beliefs about God and ourself, and we want to be able to figure out if those are true or false. So having a starting point isn't what's relevantly similar. It's the kind of starting point. Have you identified the laws of thought by which we think about anything else? Or are you making an assertion about what is real and beginning there? So that's what rational presuppositionalism does. We want to use reason to test our basic beliefs, starting with those before we get into other disputes that assume those. If we get into other disputes that assume things we haven't yet agreed on, then we'll be interminably arguing. There'll be no end to it. So it's a method that proposes a way to find meaning, to settle disputes, and to come to agreement so we can go on together and grow. Thanks for joining me on my hike.